The fluorescent lights of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center hummed with their usual sterile consistency, but tonight on the fourth floor trauma wing, the air felt different. Heavy, charged with something that tasted like violence and despair. Dr. Harrison Blake stood behind the reinforced observation glass of room 402, his knuckles white against the clipboard he gripped like a lifeline. Inside that room, strapped to a hospital bed with leather restraints meant for the criminally insane, was a man who had become something less than human and far more dangerous. Master Chief Garrett Sullivan, Navy SEAL, sniper, legend. Now just a screaming, thrashing nightmare that nobody could reach. Blake checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until they would pump Sullivan full of sedatives strong enough to drop a horse. 13 minutes until they induced a medical coma and hoped the man's brain didn't cook itself from the inside out. The fever had him. 104.6 degrees. Sepsis from the gunshot wounds that had turned half his torso into a patchwork of infected tissue and emergency sutures. But it wasn't the fever that terrified the staff. It was the violence. 2 days ago, Sullivan had broken orderly Rodriguez's jaw with a headbutt delivered with such precision that the attending surgeon remarked it looked almost professional. Yesterday, he'd nearly strangled nurse practitioner Williams with an IV tube before security could drag him off. This morning, he'd thrown a bedpan with enough force to crack the observation glass. The man wasn't just sick. He was a weapon that hadn't been deactivated. Inside room 402, Sullivan yanked against the leather restraints with strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone in his condition. His body was emaciated from weeks of infection and blood loss, but even reduced to sinew and bone, his frame radiated a terrible coiled power. Scars covered him like a map of forgotten wars. Shrapnel marks from Helmand Province, a knife wound from the Horn of Africa, and the fresh, angry suture line running from sternum to navel where surgeons had opened him up to dig out the bullets that should have killed him. His eyes were wide and unseeing, locked on some battlefield that existed only in his fractured mind. RPG 3 o'clock! Sullivan roared, his voice a raw, shredded thing that didn't belong in a hospital. Get down, Joker! Get down! He pulled against the right wrist restraint so hard the metal bed frame rattled against the floorbolts. The sound echoed through the observation area like gunfire. Blake made another note on his chart, though his hands shook slightly as he wrote. Hallucinating, fever spiking, heart rate 140. If we don't sedate him in the next 15 minutes, his heart's going to give out before the sepsis kills him. Beside him, head nurse Patricia Mills adjusted her reading glasses and rubbed her temples. She'd been a nurse for 32 years. She'd worked emergency rooms in Detroit, trauma wards in Afghanistan. She'd seen soldiers come back broken in every way a human being could break. But she'd never seen anything quite like this. We've maxed him out on haloperidol and lorazepam, she said, her voice carrying the weight of too many double shifts and not enough sleep. He burns through it like it's water. His metabolism is fighting the medications the same way he's fighting us. I can't send my people in there anymore, doctor. You saw what he did to Rodriguez. The kid needed 6 stitches, and he's still having nightmares. Blake nodded slowly. He understood. Rodriguez was 24 years old, fresh out of nursing school. He'd taken the night shift at Walter Reed because he wanted to serve veterans to give something back to the men and women who'd sacrificed for their country. Now he flinched every time someone moved too quickly near him. What about a sitter? Blake asked, though he already knew the answer. Someone to talk him down, keep him grounded until the sedation takes effect. Mills laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. I can't in good conscience order anyone to sit in that room. Sullivan isn't a patient anymore, doctor. He's a threat. And until we can get him stable, he stays restrained, and we stay on this side of the glass. The door to the observation station buzzed open. A woman walked in. She looked unremarkable at first glance. The kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second look. Brown hair pulled back in a functional, slightly messy bun. Scrubs that were clean, but faded from too many industrial wash cycles. A thermos of coffee clutched in one hand like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her face had the kind of tired around the eyes that came from seeing too much and sleeping too little. Her ID badge read, E. Ashford, RN, agency nurse. I'm here for the 1900 shift, she said quietly. Her voice had a strange quality to it, calm, almost flat, like someone who'd learned to keep all the sharp edges of emotion carefully filed down and hidden away. Blake looked up surprised. Ashford, you're the agency transfer from Mercy General. It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. You understand this is a high-security trauma ward, Blake said, letting a note of skepticism creep into his voice. We deal with amputations, severe traumatic brain injuries, combat psychosis. This isn't the geriatric wing. The woman Elena didn't flinch. She just turned her gaze to the observation window and looked through the glass at the thrashing figure of Garrett Sullivan. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Recognition, pain. It was gone before Blake could identify it, smoothed away behind that carefully neutral mask. I read the file, Elena said. Sepsis, multiple gunshot wounds, severe post-traumatic stress disorder, unresponsive to verbal de-escalation techniques. Unresponsive is a polite way of putting it, Mills interjected. He's feral. We're discussing a medically induced coma within the hour because we're out of options. Elena stepped closer to the glass. She watched Sullivan's mouth moving, watched the shapes of the words he was screaming into the empty room. Cover fire, Sullivan gasped. Extraction, eagle, broken. Joker's down, Joker's down. Elena's eyes tracked every movement, every word, reading them like text on a page. And then something shifted in her expression, something that looked almost like understanding. Don't put him in a coma, she said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact delivered with quiet authority that seemed at odds with her rumpled scrubs and tired eyes. Blake's eyebrows shot up. Excuse me. If you put him under, Elena said, her voice still calm, but carrying an edge now, something sharp beneath the surface. You trap him in the nightmare. He's not fighting you, he's fighting the ambush. He's still on that ridge. If you sedate him into unconsciousness, he stays there, in the fire, watching his team die. For however long you keep him under, Mills turned to stare at her. And you think you can ground him? Honey, we had Dr. Westbrook in there. 30 years of psychiatric experience, decorated combat therapist. Sullivan threw a bedpan at his head, hard enough to give him a concussion. Elena set her thermos down on the counter with careful precision. She walked to the supply cart and pulled out a pair of nitrile gloves. I'll take his room, she said simply. The observation station went silent except for the muffled sounds of Sullivan screaming from behind the reinforced glass. Blake found his voice first. I can't authorize that. Liability, insurance. If he hurts you, I'll sign a waiver, Elena said, already tying a plastic isolation gown over her scrubs. Her movements were practiced, efficient, like someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. You need the antibiotics in him within the next 30 minutes, or he goes into septic shock. You can't get a line in if he's thrashing. I'll get him to hold still. Blake and Mills exchanged a look. They were desperate. They were understaffed. And frankly, they were terrified of the man in room 402. If this agency nurse wanted to walk into that room, who were they to stop her? If he hurts you, Mills said, her voice heavy with warning, and something that might have been concern. Security is 30 seconds out. Just get the IV in and get out. Don't try to be a hero. Elena nodded. She didn't look like a hero. She looked like a woman walking to the gallows who had accepted her fate a long time ago. She swiped her badge on the magnetic lock. The heavy door clicked, disengaged. Elena took a deep breath. Not of fear, of preparation. She wasn't just walking into a hospital room. She was walking back into a war she'd never really left. The air inside room 402 smelled of rubbing alcohol sweat and the metallic tang of old blood mixed with fresh infection. The rhythmic whoosh click of the mechanical ventilator, which Sullivan had fought off earlier that evening, stood idle in the corner like a monument to the staff's failed attempts to help him. The only sounds were Sullivan's ragged, wet breathing and the creaking strain of leather restraints being tested to their breaking point. Elena closed the door behind her. The sound of the latch clicking into place made Sullivan freeze for half a heartbeat. Then his head snapped toward her. His eyes were bloodshot pupils, blown so wide they looked like black holes ringed with thin crescents of gray. He didn't see a nurse. In his delirium in the fever-dream battlefield that had consumed his mind, he saw an insurgent entering the kill zone. Contact front, he rasped, his voice tearing at his throat like broken glass. He lunged, and the bed heaved with the force of it. Back! Get back! Elena didn't retreat. She didn't raise her hands in the universal gesture of calm, down the one that medical staff usually employed with agitated patients. She didn't speak in the high-pitched, soothing tone nurses used for frightened children. Instead, she stood perfectly still, hands at her sides, palms open, but low, not defensive, attentive. Garrett, she said. Her voice was low, flat, authoritative, the voice of someone who expected to be heard and obeyed. Traitors, Sullivan screamed, spitting the word like venom. You left us in the valley. He yanked his left arm with such force that a fresh trickle of blood ran down his wrist, where the leather restraint was digging into skin that had already been rubbed raw. The heart monitor began to wail. Tachycardia alarm flashing angry red. 150 beats per minute, 160, 170. Elena took a step forward. "Don't come closer," Sullivan roared. The tendons in his neck stood out like cables. "I'll kill you! He choked on a cough that convulsed his entire body. Elena moved then. Not fast, not slow. She shifted with a tactical efficiency that didn't match anything in her personnel file or her resume or the tired, unremarkable appearance she'd walked in with. She closed the distance to the bedside in 3 measured steps. Sullivan lashed out with his right hand. He'd somehow partially worked it free from the restraint through sheer desperate strength. His fingers closed around a heavy plastic water pitcher on the bedside table, and he swung it with all the force a dying man could muster. It was a clumsy blow, uncoordinated, but it had weight behind it and the terrible strength of someone fighting for their life. The pitcher caught Elena on the left shoulder with a solid, meaty thud. It hurt, the kind of deep, bruising impact that would turn purple and black by morning. The kind of hit that should have made her cry out, or at least step back or raise her hands to defend herself. She did none of those things. She absorbed the blow like it was nothing more than rain, stepped into it actually using the moment of his overextension to close the final distance to the bed rail. She leaned down. Her face came within inches of his, close enough to see the sweat beating on his skin, close enough to smell the sickness on him, close enough that he could have bitten her, head-butted her, hurt her in a dozen different ways. She ignored all of that. She leaned even closer until her lips were almost brushing the stubble on his jaw, and she whispered 5 words. 5 words that Dr. Blake and Nurse Mills, watching anxiously through the observation glass, couldn't hear. 5 words that no civilian should have known. 5 words that changed everything. Wraith, blind justice, Overwatch. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if someone had cut the strings of a marionette. Sullivan's arm dropped. The tension drained from his neck. His eyes, which had been darting around the room in a frenzy, tracking enemies that existed only in his mind, locked onto hers with a terrifying laser-like focus. The heart monitor slowed its frantic beeping. 160, 140, 120. He stared at her. His chest heaved. Sweat poured down his face. The hallucinations, the hospital room transformed into a firebase. The nurses turned into insurgents. The IV stands into rifles seemed to recede, like a tide going out, leaving behind the confusion of reality. "Who?" His voice was a broken whisper. Raw, stripped of all the rage and violence. Just confusion and pain, and something that might have been hope. "Who are you?" Elena didn't answer immediately. She reached down with gentle, careful hands and loosened the restraint on his right wrist, the one that was cutting into his skin, drawing blood. He could have grabbed her then, could have used that free hand to hurt her. He didn't move. He just watched her hands, steady, precise, calloused in places that suggested she'd done hard work, physical work, somewhere in her past. "We need to get the antibiotics in Garrett," Elena said, and her voice had returned to that professional calm, though her eyes never left his. "The infection is winning. I need you to let me work." He blinked. Sweat dripped into his eyes. You said the code." "I did. That op," he swallowed hard. His throat worked. "That op is redacted. Classified. It doesn't exist." "I know," Elena said. She was already prepping the IV line, her movements practiced, and swift the muscle memory of someone who'd done this thousands of times. "That's why you're going to let me treat you. Because I'm the only person in this building who knows you're not crazy." Sullivan watched her. The rage was gone, burned away like morning fog. What remained was a profound, haunting suspicion. The kind of wariness that came from surviving too many betrayals. "Blind justice," he muttered. The words seemed to hurt him physically. "That was the comms channel, the Overwatch." Elena stopped. She held the needle, the IV catheter, ready to insert into the port in his arm. She looked at him. Really looked at him. "I was the voice, Garrett," she said quietly. "I was the one who told you to turn left at the ridge, who warned you about the thermal signatures 2 clicks north, who stayed on your channel when the ambush started." Sullivan's breath hitched. A tear, hot and angry and full of 3 years of survivor's guilt, leaked from the corner of his eye and tracked down his temple. "You," he whispered. "You're the reason I'm alive." He paused. "And you're the reason my men are dead." Elena didn't look away, didn't flinch, didn't make excuses. "Yes," she said simply. "We have a lot to talk about, Garrett, but first the medicine, Because if you die in the next hour, we never get to have that conversation. And I've been waiting 3 years to have it. Slowly, like a man in a dream, Sullivan extended his arm. He stopped fighting. Outside the observation glass, Dr. Harrison Blake's jaw hung open. "What on earth did she say to him?" he whispered. Patricia Mills just shook her head slowly, a slight shiver running down her spine, despite the warmth of the hospital. "I don't know," she said. "But look at his face. He looks like he just saw a ghost." For the next 3 hours, Elena Ashford became the guardian of room 402. She changed his dressings, a gruesome task that involved packing gauze deep into the tissue wounds on his thigh and torso, wounds that should have had any other patient screaming. Sullivan just stared at the ceiling, grinding his teeth, sweat pooling in the hollow of his collarbones. Elena worked in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers. It was the companionable silence of two people who had seen the same horrors, who understood things that couldn't be spoken out loud. Around 2 in the morning, the fever finally broke. Sullivan's temperature dropped to 100.5, his eyes cleared. For the first time in 4 days, he was truly lucid. "Water," he croaked. Elena was there instantly, holding a cup with a straw to his lips. "Slowly," she warned. "You'll vomit if you drink too fast." He drank. His eyes tracked her face. Now that the delirium had faded, he was studying her with the analytical intensity of a sniper. Looking for threats, for tells, for lies. "You're not a nurse," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am a nurse," Elena corrected, checking his vitals on the monitor. "RN, licensed in Virginia and Maryland. Current employee of Mercy General Medical Center on temporary assignment to Walter Reed." "Bullshit," Sullivan whispered. "You moved like a field operative. You took that hit from the pitcher like it was nothing. You know the code. You're something else." Elena pulled the rolling stool over and sat down. The hospital had settled into its late-night rhythm. The graveyard shift, the time when only the desperate and the dying were awake. "I am a nurse now," she said carefully. "Before that, I was an intelligence analyst for the NSA, seconded to JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command. I was the tactical communications officer for Operation Blind Justice." Sullivan flinched at the name like she'd slapped him. Blind Justice. The operation that had ended his career and killed his team. "I was in the TOC," Elena continued, her voice soft but steady. "Tactical Operations Center, Bagram Air Base. I was watching your drone feed, monitoring thermal signatures, running signal intercepts. I was the one talking to you when the comms went down." Sullivan closed his eyes. The hospital room melted away. 3 years ago, the Hindu Kush Mountains, Afghanistan. The heat had been suffocating even at night. Master Chief Garrett Sullivan, call sign Wraith, had been perched on a limestone ridge with his spotter, Petty Officer Liam Keller. Joker, they called him. Because even in the worst situations, even with death breathing down their necks, Joker could always find something to laugh about. Sullivan had been looking through the scope of his Macmillan TAC-50. 50 caliber rounds, effective range over a mile. He could see everything. The compound in the valley, the bearded men with AK-47s, the vehicles, and something else. A Western man, Caucasian, desert camouflage vest but civilian pants, expensive boots, handing a metal briefcase to a man Sullivan recognized from the target briefing as a high-value Taliban commander. "Wraith to Overwatch," Sullivan had whispered into his radio. "We have eyes on the HVT. Compound is active. But I've got something weird. Western male non-combatant interacting with primary target. Looks like he's making a delivery." The voice that had responded in his earpiece was calm. "Female. Crisp. Solid copy, Wraith. Hold position. We're analyzing thermal movement 2 clicks north of your position. Possible flank. Stand by." That voice. For 6 hours, that voice had been his lifeline, his connection to safety, to the world outside the scope, in the darkness, in the constant crawling fear. "Wraith thermal clear on your 6. You're good to adjust position." "Wraith patrol moving up the wadi. Wait 15 mics before displacement." "Wraith, we have confirmation on the HVT. Target is legitimate. Continue observation." The voice had been patient, professional. But there had been something else underneath it. A warmth. A sense that the person on the other end of that radio genuinely cared whether he lived or died. And then it had all gone wrong. Sullivan had been watching the Western man seal the deal with the Taliban commander, watching the briefcase change hands, and he'd made the call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Overwatch, I need higher to confirm. Western male on site. This doesn't feel right. Request permission to continue observation." The voice had responded immediately. Urgent now. The calm shattered. "Wraith negative. You are compromised. Thermal signatures multiplying. You have enemy movement converging on your position. Extract immediately to Rally Point Alpha. I say again, extract now. But it had been too late. The mortars had started falling before Joker could even get to his feet. Ambush, ambush, Joker had screamed into the radio. We are taking effective fire from the east, multiple technicals. We need... The explosion had been close. Too close. Sullivan had felt the heat of it against his face. Pull back to extraction Alpha, the female voice had ordered, and for the first time there had been fear in it. Real fear. Wraith, you have a technical moving up the wadi. 200 meters. Engage. Sullivan had fired, dropped the driver. But there were too many. The mortars walked up the ridge like the footsteps of a giant. 1, 2, 3. The third one had caught Joker. Sullivan would never forget the sound. The wet, tearing sound of shrapnel meeting flesh. The way Joker's scream had been cut off mid-breath. He dragged his spotter, tried to stop the arterial spray from the neck wound, tried to keep pressure on it while also returning fire and calling for help. And the radio had filled with static and screams. And through it all, that voice. Wraith, stay with me. Keep talking. I won't disconnect. Focus on my voice. Breathe. The medevac had arrived 2 hours later. 2 hours of Sullivan lying in the dirt holding Joker's body, listening to that voice telling him to breathe, to stay awake, to fight. By the time the helicopter landed, Sullivan was the only one left alive. Back in the hospital room, Sullivan opened his eyes. He looked at Elena. I thought I imagined you, he whispered. I thought you were just my brain trying to comfort me while I bled out. I maintained the connection for 4 hours, Elena said, and her voice trembled slightly for the first time. Even after your radio went dead, after the medevac confirmed pickup of one survivor. I kept talking, just in case you could still hear me. I violated protocol. My commanding officer ordered me to switch frequencies to coordinate the airstrike. I refused. Why? Sullivan asked. Elena's eyes glistened. Because I sent you there, she said. A tear escaped, tracking down her cheek. The intelligence assessment that put you on that ridge, that cleared your extraction route, that said the area was secure. It came from my desk, from my analysis. I said the route was clear. The silence in the room was deafening. The twist, the knife in the wound. She wasn't just his savior. She was the architect of his nightmare. Sullivan's face hardened. You authorized the mission. I provided the assessment, Elena said. It was wrong. We were being fed false data by a double agent embedded in the Afghan National Army. I didn't catch it. I should have. I didn't. And by the time I realized, by the time I found the discrepancy in the signal intercepts, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. Sullivan looked away, staring at the white hospital wall. The heart monitor beeped faster. Anger and grief and confusion swirled in his chest like competing tides. He wanted to strangle her. He wanted to thank her. He wanted to scream at her and hold her and ask her why she hadn't just let him die with his brothers. So you're here to what? Sullivan asked, his voice cold, hard. A tone wash away the guilt by changing my bedpans and pretending we're even. I'm here because you're in danger, Garrett, Elena said, and her voice dropped to a whisper. She glanced at the observation window where Blake and Mills were still watching. She leaned in closer. The sepsis is manageable now. The fever's breaking. You'll live. But that's not the danger I'm talking about, Sullivan frowned. I'm in a hospital. I'm dying of infection. I think I know the danger. No, Elena said. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully and held it up for him to see. It was a printout, a pharmacy order. Patient name, Sullivan Garrett, room 402. Look at the medication list, she said softly. Sullivan squinted at it. His eyes, trained to read wind speed and elevation at 1,000 yards, struggled with the small print. But he'd been a medic in his early SEAL days. He knew medications. Ceftriaxone, vancomycin, normal saline, morphine, and there near the bottom, potassium chloride, 80 milliequivalents, IV push. His eyes widened. That's, he started. A lethal dose, Elena finished. It would stop your heart in seconds, make it look like cardiac arrest from sepsis. Natural causes. Nobody would question it. Sullivan tried to sit up, but his body betrayed him. Too weak. He fell back against the pillows. Who ordered this? According to the system, Dr. Jonathan Hamilton, Elena said. Except there is no Dr. Jonathan Hamilton in the Walter Reed registry. The credentials are fake. The order was placed 2 hours ago. It's scheduled to be administered in your morning IV bag. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Which means in about 4 hours, someone is going to walk in here and kill you. Sullivan stared at her. The double agent, he said slowly. The one who fed you the bad intel. You said he was dead, Elena said. Drone strike, 2 weeks after the ambush. That's the official story. She met his eyes. But that's not the truth, Garrett. The double agent wasn't just some Afghan soldier. The leak came from higher up, inside our own command structure. Someone wanted your team dead because you saw something you weren't supposed to see. Sullivan's mind raced. The Western man, the briefcase, the compound. What did we see, he asked. I don't know yet, Elena admitted, but I spent 3 years investigating, 3 years piecing together fragments, and what I found scared me enough to quit the NSA, to change careers, to become a nurse so I could work here at Walter Reed, waiting for the day you might be transferred here. You've been waiting for me. I've been hunting for the truth, Elena said, and when I saw your transfer order 3 days ago, I knew. I knew they'd come for you because you were getting better. The medications were working, the therapy was helping. Eventually you'd remember. Eventually you'd start asking questions. She stood up, walked to the window, peered through the blinds at the parking lot 4 stories below. So here's what's going to happen, she said. In about 90 minutes, Dr. Blake is going to authorize your sedation coma. That gives us a narrow window. We're getting you out of here before the morning shift, before whoever ordered that potassium chloride comes to check their work. Sullivan stared at her. I can't walk. My leg is shredded. I know, Elena said. She turned to face him, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that wasn't guilt or professionalism or calm. It was determination. The kind of determination that came from someone who had made a decision and would see it through to the end no matter the cost. That's why we're not walking, she said. Then how? We're taking the hearse. The digital clock on the wall flickered to 4:15 a.m. The hospital had descended into that peculiar twilight hour where only the gravest emergencies and the dead were moving through the corridors. Elena worked with a precision that went beyond mere nursing competence. This was something else entirely. She didn't just unplug the monitoring equipment, she hacked it. From the waistband of her scrubs, she pulled a small tablet. Not hospital issue. Custom hardware, the kind that came from knowing people in dark corners of the intelligence community. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced speed, and within 90 seconds, she'd spliced a loop into the central monitoring station's feed. On the screens at the nurse's station, Garrett Sullivan's vital signs would continue to display. Heart rate steady at 98 beats per minute. Oxygen saturation at 94%. Blood pressure stable. To anyone watching the monitors, the monster in room 402 was finally sleeping peacefully. The reality was about to be very different. You have to trust me, Elena whispered, pulling a heavy black zippered bag from the bottom of the medical supply cart. It wasn't a laundry bag, it was a body bag. Standard issue for the morgue. Sullivan stared at it, his face pale and beaded with cold sweat. The pain in his leg was a dull, throbbing roar that threatened to overwhelm everything else, but the adrenaline of the situation was sharpening his mind in ways the fever had dulled. I'm not going out in a bag, he said. That's bad juju. It's the only way out of this ward without a security clearance scan, Elena hissed back. The morgue elevator is the only one that doesn't require a badge swipe for the basement levels. The night orderlies use it to transport deceased patients to the loading bay. We have a 10-minute window before Stan comes through on his rounds. If we're not in the basement by then, we're trapped. Sullivan gritted his teeth and gave a single sharp nod. Do it. Getting a 200-pound Navy SEAL with a shattered leg and recovering sepsis infection into a body bag turned out to be a nightmare of physics and pain. Elena worked quickly, supporting his weight as best she could, guiding his movements with the kind of tactical awareness that didn't come from nursing school. Sullivan suppressed a scream as his damaged leg shifted his vision, graying out for a second. Sweat poured down his face. Breathe, Elena commanded softly, her voice taking on that same quality it had during the ambush. Calm, steady, the voice of someone who wouldn't panic no matter what. Dissociate from the pain. Go to your happy place. My happy place is a bar in San Diego. Sullivan grunted through clenched teeth as she maneuvered him into the bag. And you're buying the first 3 rounds. Deal, Elena said. Now stay absolutely silent. If you cough, if you groan, if you make any sound at all, we're both dead. Do you understand? He nodded and she zipped the bag shut. Darkness swallowed him whole. The smell was overwhelming. Plastic and chemical disinfectant and his own sweat. The bag pressed against his face, making every breath feel like work. He felt the lurch as Elena hoisted the gurney and unlocked the wheels. Then movement. The squeak of one wheel that needed oil. the subtle vibration of the floor tiles passing beneath. The journey down the hallway was a symphony of terrifying sounds, all magnified by the darkness and his inability to see what was happening. Voices in the distance, the hum of fluorescent lights, the beep of someone's IV pump. Every sound felt like it was announcing their presence, screaming that something wasn't right. "Night, Elena," a voice called out. Sullivan's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he was certain it would be audible through the plastic. That was Nurse Mills, head nurse, the woman who'd been watching through the observation glass. "Good night, Patricia." Elena's voice came back easy and casual. "Just taking some materials down to restock and grabbing more saline on the way back up." "All right." "Hey, is he finally asleep?" "The ghost." Sullivan felt the gurney pause. Every muscle in his body tensed. "Out like a light," Elena said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Fever finally broke about an hour ago. Got the antibiotics and vitals are stabilizing. I think we'll get a quiet shift for once." "Thank God," Mills said. "Maybe we can all get some rest." "You look exhausted, honey. Make sure you take your break." "Will do." The gurney started moving again. Sullivan forced himself to breathe slowly, to stay calm, to trust the woman who was both his savior and the architect of his worst nightmare. The sounds of the ward faded. The air temperature changed slightly. They must have entered the elevator lobby. He heard Elena press the call button. The ding of the elevator's arrival was loud as a gunshot in the quiet hallway. They rolled forward. The doors slid shut with a pneumatic hiss. The sensation of descending was nauseating in the enclosed space. Sullivan's stomach lurched. He fought back their urge to vomit, knowing that if he did trapped in this bag, he'd likely aspirate and die before Elena could even get him out. The elevator seemed to descend forever. Finally, mercifully, it stopped. The doors opened. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees. The air smelled different. Formaldehyde, disinfectant, death, the morgue. "We're clear," Elena whispered, and he felt her unzipping the bag just enough for him to breathe fresh air. Sullivan gasped, gulping down the cool basement air like a drowning man breaking the surface. "That was the longest 3 minutes of my life," he rasped. "We're not done yet," Elena said, pushing the gurney toward what he assumed was the loading bay. "The hearse is waiting. My contact left it unlocked. We just need to get you inside and—" She stopped. The gurney stopped. Sullivan's every sense went on high alert. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the sudden tension in Elena's hands on the gurney rail, in the way her breathing had changed. "You're off shift early, Nurse Ashford." The voice was deep, smooth, cultured, the voice of a man who was used to being in control, used to being obeyed. Sullivan heard Elena's sharp intake of breath. "And you seem to be stealing government property," the voice continued. "Master Chief Sullivan is a very expensive asset. We can't just have him wandering off, can we?" Through the small gap in the bag, Sullivan could see a sliver of the loading bay, concrete, fluorescent lights, and a shadow. A tall shadow cast by someone standing near the vehicle that was supposed to be their escape route. Sullivan's hand, hidden inside the bag, slowly reached for the small scalpel Elena had slipped him earlier. Just in case. The man stepped into his limited field of view. Expensive suit, easily $5,000. Silver hair perfectly styled. A face that belonged on a corporate board or a country club, and eyes that were completely, utterly dead. Flat, the eyes of a shark. Recognition slammed into Sullivan like a physical blow. "Thorne," he rasped from inside the bag, the name clawing its way up from his suppressed memories. "Vincent Thorne." The man smiled. It was a terrible smile, all teeth and no warmth. "Master Chief Sullivan, I'm flattered you remember me, though I was hoping the sepsis would have scrambled your memory enough to make this easier." Through the gap, Sullivan could see Thorne pull a smartphone from his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen showing a security camera feed of the morgue elevator, backup cameras they'd missed. "I've been watching your little escape attempt with great interest," Thorne said, pocketing the phone. "Really, Dr. Ashford? Did you think I wouldn't have redundant surveillance?" Elena's voice was tight, controlled. "Let us pass, Thorne." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Thorne said. He pulled a silenced pistol from inside his jacket. A Sig Sauer P-226, professional weapon. The kind someone who knew what they were doing would choose. He aimed it casually at Elena's chest. "You've caused quite a lot of trouble, Dr. Ashford. Or should I say former senior intelligence analyst Ashford. The NSA was very disappointed when you resigned. You had such a promising career ahead of you." "You set us up," Sullivan growled from the bag. His mind was racing, putting pieces together. "Operation Blind Justice. You changed the coordinates. You sent us into that ambush. I managed risk, Thorne corrected, his voice maddeningly calm. Your team stumbled onto a very delicate business arrangement, a heroin shipment that was financing some very essential allies. You weren't supposed to be there, Master Chief. You were supposed to be 5 miles east watching a completely different compound. But someone in the command chain got creative with the mission parameters. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The Western man, Sullivan said. In the compound. That was your operative. Very good, Thorne said. I see the brain damage isn't as severe as I'd hoped. Yes, that was one of my logistics coordinators. Delivering payment to our Taliban friends. $2 million and 50 kilos of pharmaceutical-grade heroin. In exchange, they guaranteed safe passage for my supply convoys through their territory. It's simple economics, really. Cheaper to pay the enemy than to hire additional security. Elena's hands tightened on the gurney rail. You were running protection money to the Taliban, while American soldiers were dying fighting them. While American soldiers were dying protecting my profit margins, Thorne corrected. Aegis Global Solutions has $4.2 billion in defense contracts. We provide logistics, supply chain management, security services. We make the wars run smoothly. And sometimes to make that happen, we have to make arrangements that the Pentagon wouldn't officially approve. He took a step closer, the pistol never wavering. Your team saw something they shouldn't have seen, and when you radioed it in, when you reported that Western male at the compound, certain people panicked. Coordinates were changed. The ambush was arranged. 5 Navy SEALs died to protect a very lucrative business relationship. Sullivan could feel rage building in his chest like a physical force. His brothers, Joker, all of them. Dead because of money, because of heroin, because some corporate executive in an expensive suit had decided their lives were worth less than his profit margin. You couldn't let us leave, Sullivan said, his voice deadly quiet. We were witnesses. Exactly, Thorne agreed. And when you survived, when you were medevaced out against all odds, I had a problem. A loose end. I tried to solve it the easy way. Let the sepsis do the work. But you're remarkably resilient, Master Chief. And then Dr. Ashford here started poking around, asking questions, connecting dots. She became another problem. He raised the pistol, slightly centering it on Elena's sternum. So here's what happens now. You're going to step away from the gurney, Doctor. You're a smart woman, former NSA. You understand how the game is played. You walk away right now, you disappear, you live. You can start over somewhere else. New name, new life. I'll even help arrange it. But if you try to play hero, if you try to save this broken seal, then you become just another tragic suicide in the hospital parking lot. A nurse who cracked under the pressure of dealing with violent PTSD patients. It happens all the time. Elena stood perfectly still. Sullivan couldn't see her face, but he could imagine it. That calm mask she wore. That careful neutrality that hid whatever storms were raging underneath. And what about him? She asked quietly. What happens to Sullivan? He has an unfortunate cardiac event, Thorne said. The sepsis was too severe. His heart gives out. The potassium chloride I ordered will be administered by a very reliable contractor who's been waiting for my signal. Sullivan dies. I tie up a loose end. The world moves on. The silence in the loading bay stretched taut as a wire. Then Elena did something that Sullivan would remember for the rest of his life. She laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It wasn't hysterical. It was cold, hard. The laugh of someone who'd just been dealt a losing hand and decided to bluff anyway. You're right, Thorne, she said. I do know how the game is played. That's why I didn't come alone. She raised her left hand. In it, she held what looked like a small remote control. Black plastic, red button under her thumb. A dead man's switch. Thorne's eyes narrowed. What is that? I rigged the main oxygen feed line, Elena said calmly. The one that runs directly along the wall behind you. Shaped charge, made from cleaning supplies and a defibrillator battery. Basic chemistry. The kind of thing they teach you in NSA field training for when you need to make contingency plans in hostile territory. She smiled, and it was just as cold as Thorne's had been. You fire that gun, my thumb slips. This entire basement becomes a fireball. You, me, Sullivan, and half the hospital go up. The loading bay is directly under the ICU. 97 patients, 43 staff. They all die. Thorne's face went very still. You're bluffing. Maybe, Elena said. Or maybe I spent 3 years planning for this exact scenario. Maybe I've had enough time to think through every contingency. Maybe I'm exactly crazy enough to do it. Her thumb pressed down slightly on the button. Not enough to trigger anything, just enough to show she was serious. The question is, are you willing to bet your life that I'm lying? The standoff hung there, suspended in the cool basement air like frost. Sullivan made his decision. He'd managed to work his right leg partially free from the bag's zipper. The pain was excruciating, like someone was driving nails through his thigh, but pain was just data, information, something to be acknowledged and then set aside. Joker used to say that SEALs didn't feel pain differently than other people. They just decided it didn't matter. Sullivan had never believed that until right now. He kicked. The gurney's locking brake disengaged with a metallic clang. The heavy steel table lurched forward, propelled by the force of his kick and Elena's quick push. 200 pounds of metal and wounded SEAL slammed into Vincent Thorne's knees. The man stumbled backward. The gun went off. The suppressed shot was still loud in the concrete space. The bullet went wide, shattering the rear window of the black van that was supposed to be their escape vehicle. Safety glass exploded into 1,000 glittering fragments. Thorne buckled, trying to regain his balance, but Elena was already moving. She grabbed a heavy oxygen cylinder from the equipment rack beside her and swung it like a baseball bat. Years of frustration, years of guilt, years of living with the deaths of 5 men on her conscience. All of it went into that swing. The cylinder connected with Thorne's temple with a sickening wet crunch. The CEO of Aegis Global Solutions dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The gun clattered across the concrete. Blood immediately began pooling beneath his head. For a moment, the only sound was their heavy breathing. Jesus, Sullivan breathed finally, fighting his way completely out of the body bag. He nearly fell trying to stand on his damaged leg, had to catch himself on the gurney. Did you really rig the hospital to blow? Elena looked down at the remote in her hand, the garage door opener for the van. She tossed it to him. No, she said, but he didn't know that. Despite everything, despite the pain and the fear, and the adrenaline still coursing through his system, Sullivan found himself laughing. A raw, disbelieving laugh. You're insane. I'm motivated, Elena corrected. She was already moving, checking Thorne's pulse. He's alive, probably a skull fracture. He'll need medical attention soon, or he might die. Good, Sullivan said, the laugh dying in his throat. No, Elena said sharply. Not good. We need him alive. He's our proof. He just confessed to everything. The heroin, the ambush, the murder. We need him to stand trial. She looked up at Sullivan and her eyes were hard. Besides, execution is too merciful for him. I want him to spend the next 40 years in a federal supermax thinking about what he did. I want him to wake up every day in a concrete box knowing that a nurse and a broken SEAL took down his entire empire. Sullivan stared at her. This woman who had been a voice in his ear, who had sent him into hell, who had stayed on the line while his world burned, who had quit her career and spent 3 years preparing for this moment. Get in the van, Elena said. We need to move before someone comes to investigate that gunshot. They drove for 6 hours. Elena drove like she did everything else. Fast, precise, without hesitation. They switched highways 3 times, took back roads through West Virginia that probably hadn't been maintained since the Carter administration, and finally wound their way up a gravel track that could barely be called a road into the deep, misty heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Sullivan passed in and out of consciousness in the back. Elena had hooked him up to a portable IV she'd stolen from the hospital. The antibiotics were fighting the war inside his blood. But the physical toll of the escape had been immense. Every bump in the road sent fresh agony through his leg. Every turn made his head swim. But he was alive, and he was free. When the van finally stopped, it was in front of a hunting cabin that looked like it hadn't been used in a decade. Weathered wood, sagging porch, windows dark. But there was something solid about it, something that spoke of careful construction and stubborn endurance. Where are we? Sullivan groaned as Elena opened the back doors. The mountain air was crisp and smelled of pine and wet earth. After the recycled hospital air and the chemical stink of the body bag, it was almost overwhelming. My father's place, Elena said, helping him out of the van with surprising strength for someone her size. He was a survivalist, one of those people who was convinced the government would eventually turn on its own citizens, and you needed to be ready for when it happened. She half-carried, half-dragged Sullivan toward the cabin. He died 2 years ago, heart attack while chopping wood. I kept the property. Nobody knows I own it. It's not in my name. It's held in a trust he set up in the 80s. No cell service, well water, generator power, as off the grid as you can get in the 21st century. Getting Sullivan inside and onto the dusty leather couch took another 10 minutes. By the time Elena had him settled and covered with blankets, he was shaking from exhaustion and pain. But she wasn't done. She built a fire in the stone hearth, boiled water, cleaned his wounds again, packing fresh gauze into the deep tissue damage with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the woman who just knocked out a CEO with an oxygen tank. She made soup from packets. It was terrible. Instant sodium and preservatives. But it was warm, and it was food, and Sullivan's body needed both. It was domesticity born of desperation. Two fugitives hiding in the mountains, one dying SEAL and one guilt-ridden intelligence analyst, playing house while the world outside looked for them. "You knew Vincent Thorne," Elena said finally. It wasn't a question. She handed him a mug of broth and sat on the floor rug, her back against the couch. The fire cast dancing shadows across her face. Sullivan stared into the flames. Memories were surfacing now, things the fever and the trauma had buried. "Bagram," he said slowly, "about a week before the mission. I saw him in the mess hall. He wasn't wearing a uniform, just that expensive suit. He stood out like a sore thumb. He was meeting with our colonel. I remember thinking he looked at us like we were inventory. Assets to be managed. Numbers on a spreadsheet." Elena nodded. Aegis Global Solutions has a $4.2 billion contract with the Department of Defense. They handle logistics, supply chains, transportation, security services. They're one of the biggest private military contractors in the world. She pulled out a laptop from a bag she'd brought from the van, opened it. The screen glowed blue in the darkened cabin. "The NSA started seeing flags about 18 months into my tenure, money moving into accounts in Pakistan, accounts that were linked to Taliban commanders. Not small amounts, millions of dollars. But it was complex, layered, hidden behind shell companies and intermediaries, hard to prove. She pulled up files, financial records, transaction logs, signal intercepts. I started investigating on my own time, connecting dots, and what I found was a pattern. Aegis was paying protection money to the Taliban. Huge sums. In exchange, the Taliban guaranteed safe passage for Aegis convoys through their territory. No IEDs, no ambushes, no attacks. Sullivan's grip on the mug tightened until his knuckles turned white. He was paying the enemy, while we were dying fighting them. "It's cheaper than hiring more security," Elena said bitterly. "That's the calculation. Lose a convoy to an IED and Aegis has to replace vehicles, cargo personnel, insurance claims, investigations, bad publicity. But pay the Taliban a protection fee and the convoys get through untouched. Better profit margins." She brought up another file. This one showed a map, Afghanistan, the Hindu Kush region, with overlays showing convoy routes and attack patterns. "Look at this," she said. "Aegis convoys, 0 attacks along these routes for 18 months. But coalition forces in the same areas, constant contact, IEDs every week, ambushes, small arms fire. The Taliban were hitting our troops while letting Aegis shipments pass through unmolested." Sullivan felt sick. Someone should have noticed. "Someone did," Elena said quietly. "Me. I wrote a report, flagged it for my superiors, recommended investigation, and I was told to drop it. That Aegis was a strategic partner, that rocking the boat would jeopardize important contracts, that I should focus on my assigned mission parameters and leave the policy decisions to people above my pay grade." She closed the laptop. "So I dropped it, officially, but I kept investigating, quietly, and that's when I found the intel about the compound, the meeting. I thought it was a high-level Taliban planning session. I thought we could disrupt their command structure. I pushed for surveillance. I provided the assessment that your team's area of operations was clear." Her voice broke slightly. "I didn't know it was a payment drop. I didn't know Thorne had people on the ground making the exchange. And I didn't know that someone in the command chain was going to change your coordinates to make sure you saw it." Sullivan processed this slowly. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was uglier than anything he'd imagined. "We were witnesses," he said, "to Thorne's operation, so someone made sure we were silenced." "Exactly," Elena said. "And when you survived, when you were medevaced out, Thorne had a problem. He needed you dead before you could piece together what you'd seen, before you could testify, before you could bring down his entire operation." Sullivan looked at her. Really looked at her. This woman who had carried 3 years of guilt, who had quit her career and reinvented herself as a nurse, who had been waiting at Walter Reed for him to show up. "You've been hunting him," Sullivan said, "this whole time." Elena nodded. "I checked your file every week, tracked your recovery, your PTSD treatment, your transfers between facilities. When I saw the order to move you to Walter Reed 3 days ago, I knew. I knew Thorne would make his move, because you were getting better. The medications were working. The therapy was helping. Eventually, you'd remember. Eventually, you'd start asking questions. She met his eyes. I couldn't let you die because of my mistake. I had to be there. I had to protect you. And I had to find a way to expose Thorne, to make sure your team's deaths meant something. The fire crackled. Outside wind moved through the pines with a sound like the ocean. So what now? Sullivan asked. We're two fugitives in a cabin. Thorne will wake up. He'll spin some story. He's got lawyers, money, connections. Men like him don't go down easy. Elena stood up, walked to a rusted metal cabinet in the corner of the room. She keyed in a combination lock. The door swung open. My father was paranoid, she said, reaching inside, but he was also prepared. She pulled out a heavy green metal box, military issue. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside was a high-frequency military radio, an encrypted hard drive, and a stack of cash that had to be at least $50,000. He believed the government would eventually turn on its own people, Elena said. He wasn't entirely wrong. This drive contains the raw signal intercepts from the night of Operation Blind Justice. The ones my superiors told me to delete, the ones that show the coordinate changes, the communications between Thorne's people and the Taliban, the financial transactions. Sullivan sat up straighter, ignoring the screaming protest from his leg. You have proof. I have data, Elena corrected, but it's encrypted with a rolling cipher key I can't crack. I'm an analyst, not a cryptographer. The encryption is military grade, probably NSA level. To open this to make it usable as evidence, we need the source code. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. Where's the source code? Elena smiled. It was a dangerous smile, the smile of someone who'd spent 3 years planning something audacious. The Aegis Global Secure Server Facility, Fairfax County, Virginia. That's where Thorne keeps his digital infrastructure, financial records, communication logs, everything, including the encryption keys for classified data. Sullivan stared at her. You want to break into the most secure private military headquarters in the world? Yes. Steal their encryption codes? Yes. Upload the evidence to expose a multi-billion-dollar conspiracy? Yes. And presumably not get killed in the process. Elena's smile widened slightly. That would be the ideal outcome. Sullivan laughed. It hurt his ribs, but he couldn't help it. The sheer audacity of it, the impossible nature of what she was proposing. We're two people, he said. I can barely walk. You're a nurse, against a private army, and God knows how many security systems. We have 3 months, Elena said. Maybe 4 before they track us here. Time to plan, time to prepare, time to heal. She sat down next to him on the couch, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. I've been waiting 3 years for this, Garrett. 3 years living with the guilt of your team's deaths. 3 years planning how to make it right. I didn't save you from that hospital just to hide in a cabin for the rest of our lives. Sullivan looked at the encrypted drive, at the radio, at this woman who was both his salvation and his curse. When do we start? He asked. 3 months passed in the mountain wilderness like a fever dream. The first month was survival and recovery. Elena changed Sullivan's dressings daily, forcing him through physical therapy exercises that made him want to scream. But the human body, when pushed correctly, could perform miracles of healing. The antibiotics cleared the infection. The wounds began to close. Scar tissue formed. Sullivan's leg would never be what it was. He'd walk with a permanent limp. His running days were over. But he could walk. He could move. And with Elena's help, he could fight. The second month was skills transfer and reconnaissance. Sullivan taught Elena the basics of close-quarters combat, how to shift tactically, how to clear a room, how to shoot under stress. She was a terrible shot at first, flinching with every trigger pull. But she was disciplined and she learned fast. In return, Elena taught Sullivan the fundamentals of cyber infiltration, how to bypass basic security systems, how to clone access cards, how to move through a digital infrastructure without leaving traces. He would never be an NSA analyst, but he learned enough to be dangerous. They used the high-frequency radio to monitor Aegis communications. Elena had the encryption protocols memorized from her NSA days. They listened to security chatter, guard rotations, facility maintenance schedules, building a picture of their target. And at night, when the fire burned low and the cabin was quiet, they talked about their lives before, about what they'd lost, about what they were trying to build from the wreckage. Sullivan told her about Joker, about how Liam Keller had been the youngest on the team, 26 years old, engaged to his high school sweetheart, always laughing even when things were bad, especially when things were bad. Elena told him about the moment she'd heard the team die over the radio, how she'd violated every protocol to stay on Sullivan's channel, how her commanding officer had physically tried to pull her away from the console and she'd refused to move. They were building something. Not romance exactly, something deeper than that. A warrior's bond, the kind of connection that came from shared trauma and shared purpose. The third month was planning and preparation. Elena had used some of her father's cash to buy equipment through black market contacts in Baltimore. A decommissioned police drone with a high-resolution camera, burner laptops with hardened operating systems, directional microphones, lock-picking tools. They built a scale model of the Aegis facility in the cabin's basement using blueprints Elena had pulled from public records and satellite imagery. They ran through the infiltration plan dozens of times, identifying weaknesses, planning contingencies, memorizing guard patterns. And then Elena found it, the opportunity. She was monitoring Aegis communications on a Tuesday night when she heard the chatter about an event, a gala, a fundraiser. Vincent Thorne was hosting a Wounded Warriors charity gala at the Aegis Secure facility, bringing in elite donors, politicians, decorated veterans, using the wounded soldiers he'd helped create as props for tax-deductible philanthropy. The irony was grotesque, but it was also perfect. "We don't assault the fortress," Elena said, spreading the new intelligence across their planning table. "We walk through the front door." Sullivan studied the event details, guest list, security protocols, timing. "Forged credentials," he said slowly. "I go in as private security for one of the donors. You're my +1, cybersecurity consultant." "They expect Wraith dead," Elena agreed. "They won't recognize a bearded man in a tuxedo with a limp. You'll be invisible." "Hidden in plain sight," Sullivan said, "using their arrogance against them." Elena smiled. "Exactly." They spent the next 2 weeks refining the plan, creating false identities, forging credentials that would pass electronic verification, rehearsing their roles. Elena would breach the server room in the basement while Sullivan provided overwatch and security. They'd upload the decryption key, extract the evidence, and disappear before anyone knew they'd been there. It was audacious, borderline suicidal, the kind of plan that had maybe a 30% chance of success. But 30% was better than nothing, and they'd both been living on borrowed time for 3 years now. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear. The Aegis Secure facility in Fairfax County looked less like a military installation and more like a converted warehouse that had been given a corporate facelift. But Elena and Sullivan knew better. The perimeter fence was electrified. Thermal cameras covered every approach. Armed response teams patrolled in 15-minute intervals. Inside it was grotesque opulence. Chandeliers hung from the industrial ceiling. Champagne flowed. Men in $10,000 suits shook hands and posed for photos with carefully selected wounded veterans in wheelchairs. The veterans were props, decoration, proof that Aegis cared about the troops. Sullivan stood at the bar nursing a club soda, watching everything. His beard was neatly trimmed. His tuxedo fit perfectly, hiding the scars and the weapons. His limp was just pronounced enough to suggest old injury without drawing attention. He was invisible. Just another middle-aged security consultant. One of dozens at the event. Elena was across the room, engaged in conversation with a Pentagon procurement officer, playing her role perfectly. Laughing at his jokes, asking intelligent questions about cybersecurity protocols. They'd been inside for 40 minutes when Elena excused herself to the restroom. Sullivan's earpiece crackled to life. Elena's voice barely a whisper. "I'm at the service elevator, looping the camera feed now. You have 60 seconds to get to the fire stairwell on the north wall." Sullivan set down his glass and shifted position. Not fast, just purposeful. A man looking for a restroom, a man checking his phone, a man moving through the crowd with the casual confidence of someone who belonged. He slipped through the staff-only door just as the security guard turned the corner. The door closed behind him with a soft click. "Clear," he whispered. He descended the concrete stairs quickly, his bad leg protesting but holding. The basement level was cool and hummed with the sound of massive server cooling fans. This was the brain of the beast, the digital heart of Aegis Global Solutions. Elena met him at the junction. She'd stripped off her evening gown to reveal a black tactical bodysuit underneath. She was working on a keypad with a small electronic device. 30 seconds, she muttered. "Encryption is military grade, but I've got the bypass protocols." Sullivan pulled the suppressed Glock they'd acquired in Baltimore. He pressed his back to the wall covering the hallway. Footsteps, heavy boots, tactical gear. "We've got company," he whispered urgently. 2 guards, maybe 3. 20 seconds, Elena said, not looking up. Her fingers flew across the device. The footsteps were getting closer. Sullivan made a decision. He stepped out from cover. The two guards saw him and their hands went to their weapons. But Sullivan was faster, not because he was younger or stronger, because he'd done this 10,000 times, because muscle memory and training took over when conscious thought was too slow. Pop, 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 pop. 4 suppressed shots, 2 controlled pairs, aimed at the ceramic plate carriers both guards wore. The rounds hit center mass, didn't penetrate, but the kinetic impact was like being hit with a sledgehammer. Both guards went down, wind knocked out of them, stunned. Sullivan was on them before they could recover. 2 quick strikes with the pistol grip. Lights out. He dragged their unconscious bodies into a janitor's closet. "We're in," Elena said behind him. The keypad light had turned green. They entered the server room together. It was exactly what Elena had described. A cathedral of blue blinking lights, rows upon rows of black server towers stretching into the darkness. The digital archive of Aegis Global Solutions, financial records, communication logs, classified military data, all of it, including the encryption keys they needed. Elena ran to the main terminal. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with the practiced speed of someone who'd done this for years at the NSA. "Initiating handshake," she said. "Drive connected, uploading decryption protocols. Systems trying to reject it, but I'm bypassing the firewall." "Almost there." A red light began flashing on the ceiling. Sullivan's blood ran cold. "Silent alarm," he said. "They know we're here." "Upload is at 40%, Elena said, not looking up. "I need 3 minutes." "You've got 2, Sullivan said, moving to the door. He could hear the elevator humming. The cavalry was coming, and they were bringing a lot more than 2 guards this time. The hallway outside the server room didn't just explode with gunfire. It disintegrated into a strobe light nightmare of muzzle flashes and shattering composite panels. One moment the corridor was a sterile expanse of brushed steel and silence. The next it was chaos incarnate. Sullivan slid across the polished floor, his shoulders slamming into the heavy steel door frame, just as a hail of 5.56 rounds chewed up the wall where his head had been a second earlier. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the screaming protest of his damaged leg. This was the friction, the chaotic, deafening reality of close-quarters battle that no amount of planning could account for. "Status," he roared over the din, popping out to fire 2 controlled rounds down the hall. He saw a mercenary stumble, his vest absorbing the impact, but the suppression worked. The squad advancing on them halted, retreating behind the corner of the junction. Inside the server room, Elena was huddled beneath the main console, her face illuminated by the harsh, rhythmic pulsing of blue server lights. She wasn't cowering, she was working. Her fingers flew across the laptop keyboard with a speed that blurred in the low light, her eyes darting between her screen and the massive Aegis mainframe towers looming above her, like black monoliths. "The encryption is mutating," Elena shouted, her voice tight, but devoid of hysteria. "Thorn's system is trying to isolate the drive. It's fighting me like a biological immune system. I have to rewrite the handshake protocol manually." "I don't need the tech specs, Elena." Sullivan fired again, shattering a light fixture 30 feet away to plunge the approach into darkness. He was buying them seconds with darkness and fear, but he was running low on ammunition. He checked the magazine of the Glock. 3 rounds. He had 1 spare magazine left in his pocket. "I need a time." 2 minutes, Elena yelled back. "The upload is at 60%. If I pull it now, the data corrupts. It has to be 100%, or everything we've done is useless." "We don't have 2 minutes." The enemy knew it too. They stopped firing blindly. Sullivan heard the distinct metallic clack hiss of a flashbang canister hitting the floor tiles and skittering toward him. "Eyes!" he screamed, turning away and clamping his hands over his ears. The bang was a concussive slap that rattled his teeth. Even with his eyes closed and covered, the flash seared his retinas red. Before the ringing in his ears subsided, he sensed movement. They were rushing the door while he was blind and disoriented. Sullivan shifted on pure instinct, muscle memory forged in the dusty alleyways of Ramadi and the mountains of Kandahar. He didn't rise. He stayed low, sweeping the leg of the first shadow that darkened the doorway. The mercenary fell hard, his rifle clattering away on the tile. Sullivan didn't hesitate. He rose, using the man's body as a shield, and fired point blank into the chest plate of the second man coming through the smoke. The contractor went down, winded, collapsing backward into his teammates. Sullivan grabbed the fallen mercenary's carbine, a high-end customized HK-416. He kicked the door shut with his good leg and jammed the deadbolt. "They're cutting the power," Elena warned. The blue lights on the servers flickered and died, plunging the room into total darkness save for the glow of her laptop screen. They think that stops the upload, she said, a grim smile in her voice. Wrong. I'm running off the backup battery in the drive. 75%. Outside, the door handle rattled violently. Then came the high-pitched whine of a drill. They were boring through the lock. We can't stay here, Sullivan said, his voice dropping to that lethal calm that came over him in combat. He scanned the room with eyes adjusting to darkness. There was no other exit, just rows of cooling fans and the ventilation shafts near the ceiling. The drill whined louder, metal shearing against metal. 85%, Elena whispered. 90! The lock gave way with a shriek of tortured steel. Done! Elena yanked the drive from the USB port. The packets are out. Washington Post, New York Times, FBI Cyber Division Dropbox. It's everywhere. Grab the gear, Sullivan ordered. He raised the stolen rifle, aiming at the door. We aren't going out the front. He turned and fired a controlled burst into the large industrial ventilation grate near the floor. The metal grill tore free under the impact. He kicked it in. Go, he commanded. Elena scrambled through the opening, the encrypted drive clutched in her hand like a holy relic. Sullivan fired one last suppressing burst through the door as it started to open, then dove into the shaft after her. They slid down the metal chute in complete darkness, the sound of their descent echoing like thunder. They tumbled out onto the concrete floor of the underground parking garage, the impact driving the air from Sullivan's lungs. The garage was cavernous. It smelled of oil and cold cement and exhaust. Rows of luxury cars and armored SUVs sat silent in the gloom, their chrome catching the faint glow of emergency lighting. Exit ramp is north, Sullivan gasped, helping Elena to her feet. She was shaking now, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard, but she nodded, still clutching the drive. They ran, their footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness. They reached the base of the exit ramp. Cool night air was visible through the open shutter at the top. Freedom was 50 yards away. I wouldn't! The voice boomed through the garage, amplified by the acoustics of the concrete canyon. Sullivan skidded to a halt, throwing his arm out to stop Elena. Emerging from behind a black-armored Suburban was Vincent Thorne. He looked maddeningly composed. His tuxedo was immaculate. His silver hair caught the sodium vapor lights perfectly. The only evidence of their earlier encounter was a medical bandage visible at his temple, where Elena's oxygen tank had connected. But his eyes were filled with a cold, calculating fury. The upload was very clever, Dr. Ashford, Thorne said, stepping forward. His shoes clicked on the concrete with military precision. I monitored the data stream in real time. You've sent your evidence to 3 major news outlets and a federal law enforcement agency. Congratulations. You think you've won. 4 tactical contractors flanked him, all armed, all professional. Red laser sights painted glowing dots across Sullivan's chest and Elena's torso. In Thorne's right hand, he held a dead man's switch. Black plastic housing, red plunger. His thumb pressed down on it with just enough pressure to keep the circuit closed. Sullivan's eyes tracked the garage, running tactical assessments even as his heart sank. 20 meters to target, 4 armed hostiles. 1 high-value target with a trigger device. His gaze swept the concrete support pillars. At the base of the 3 nearest columns, he saw them. Blocks of C4 explosive, wired together, blinking with steady red indicator lights. You'd bring the building down, Sullivan said, his voice flat. There are 300 people upstairs. Donors, civilians, veterans. Thorne's smile was the most terrible thing Sullivan had ever seen. Worse than any battlefield. Worse than any enemy combatant. Because it came from a place of absolute moral vacancy. Collateral damage, Thorne said simply. Tragic, yes, but necessary to protect the greater good. By which I mean Aegis Global Solutions. By which I mean my empire. He raised the detonator slightly. I blow the supports. The floor above collapses. The server room is crushed. Everyone in it dies. The guests at the gala are buried under several tons of concrete and steel. And tomorrow morning, the narrative is already written. 2 domestic terrorists, a disgraced NSA analyst addicted to painkillers, and a brain-damaged Navy SEAL suffering from PTSD. They broke into a charity event, killed security guards, caused a panic, and tragically detonated a suicide vest in the parking garage. Elena's voice was steady despite the terror Sullivan could feel radiating from her. You'd kill 300 people to protect yourself. I'd kill 3,000 if I had to, Thorne said. That's the difference between people like you and people like me. You have limits, moral boundaries you won't cross. I don't. That's why I built an empire and you're standing in a garage with a gun pointed at your head. He looked directly at Sullivan. Drop the weapon, Master Chief. Or we all die right now. Your choice. Sullivan ran the calculations. Distance, angles, reaction time. 4 tangos with rifles trained on them. One target holding a dead man's switch. If he shot Thorne, the man's thumb might slip. The charges would detonate. The building would come down on 300 people. If he surrendered, Thorne would execute them both and detonate the charges anyway. Clean up all the loose ends. If he did nothing, same result. Elena whispered, barely audible. He's going to do it anyway. He can't let us live. I know, Sullivan murmured back. His eyes flicked upward. Running directly above Thorne's head was a massive red industrial pipe. Stenciled letters read, Fire Suppression System, Halon/water mix. A plan formed. Insane. Low probability of success, but better than zero. Sullivan's lips barely moved as he whispered 3 words. The code they'd used in the mountains during training. The code that meant execute the contingency plan without question. Wraith, Overwatch, drop! Elena's eyes widened fractionally. She understood. She threw herself flat onto the oil-stained concrete. In the same heartbeat, Sullivan didn't aim the HK-416 at Thorne. He swung the barrel upward and squeezed the trigger. The burst of 5.56 rounds punched through the pressurized main pipe. The result wasn't a leak. It was a cataclysm. The pipe exploded. A jet of freezing chemical-laced water blasted downward with the force of a hydraulic hammer. It hit Vincent Thorne and his 2 nearest guards like the fist of an angry god. Thorne was knocked off his feet instantly. The detonator flew from his hands, spinning through the air, landing with a clatter and skittering across the wet floor toward a drainage grate. The other guards flinched, blinded by the sudden deluge and the roar of escaping pressure. Water thundered down, turning the garage floor into a flood zone within seconds. Sullivan flowed into motion. He didn't run, he hunted. He closed the distance in 3 strides, his damaged legs screaming but holding. He drove the rifle butt into the face of the first guard who was trying to recover. Nose crunch. The man went down. He pivoted using momentum and training, sweeping the leg of the second man and delivering a non-lethal but incapacitating stomp to the solar plexus. The guard collapsed, gasping for air. Thorne was scrambling on his hands and knees through the water, desperately clawing toward the detonator that lay 5 feet away near the drain grate. His expensive suit was soaked, his perfectly styled hair plastered to his skull. The corporate veneer stripped away, leaving just a desperate man fighting for survival. Sullivan reached him just as Thorne's fingers brushed the plastic housing of the switch. With a grimace of effort, Sullivan brought his boot down on Thorne's hand. The sound of breaking metacarpals was sickeningly loud, even over the hissing of the broken pipe. Thorne's scream was high-pitched and ragged. Sullivan kicked the detonator away. It slid across the wet concrete and dropped into the drainage grate with a splash, disappearing into the sewage system below. He grabbed Thorne by the lapels of his ruined jacket and hauled him up, slamming him against the concrete pillar, the one with C4 attached to it. He pressed the hot muzzle of the rifle under Thorne's chin. The garage fell silent, except for the steady hiss of water from the broken pipe. Elena stood up slowly, water dripping from her tactical suit and hair. Her eyes were hard as she looked at the broken man pinned against the pillar. "Do it," she said. Her voice carried no emotion, just a flat statement of fact. "Finish it, Sullivan, for Joker, for the team, for everyone he's killed." Sullivan looked into Vincent Thorne's eyes. The arrogance was gone. The sociopathic calm had shattered like safety glass. All that remained was pathetic, trembling fear. The CEO was panting, his eyes darting wordlessly, begging. Sullivan's finger tightened on the trigger. It would be so easy, so just. An eye for an eye, a life for 5 lives. For all the soldiers who died protecting Thorne's profits, for all the heroin that had flowed through Taliban territories while American boys bled out in the dust. One squeeze. That's all it would take. He remembered the hospital, the rage that had consumed him in that bed, the violence that had made him a monster in everyone's eyes. If he pulled this trigger, he wasn't Garrett Sullivan anymore. He was just another killer, another piece on Thorne's board, another man who'd let darkness win. "No," Sullivan said. He lowered the rifle. Elena gasped, stepping forward. "What he'll walk. Guys like him always walk. Money, lawyers, connections. He'll—" "Not this time," Sullivan said, his voice like grinding stones. He looked down at Thorne. "You want to be a martyr. You want to die a victim of terrorists. If I kill you, you win. You become the hero on the evening news, the brave CEO murdered by deranged veterans." He shifted his grip on the rifle and whipped the stock across Thorne's temple. Not hard enough to kill, hard enough to render unconscious. The CEO crumpled to the wet floor, broken and pathetic and very much alive. Sullivan stood over him, water pooling around his shoes. "We leave him," he said, looking at Elena. "The police are 5 minutes out. The files are public. The FBI has everything. Let him wake up in handcuffs. Let him spend the next 40 years in a federal supermax prison, watching his empire get stripped for parts. Let him rot knowing that a crippled soldier and a guilty analyst took down everything he built." He met her eyes. "Killing him would be a kindness. This is justice." Elena stared at him for a long moment, then slowly the tension left her shoulders. She nodded. "Sirens," she said. "Close. Let's go." They slipped out through a side maintenance hatch, vanishing into the cool Virginia woods, just as the blue lights of SWAT vans painted the garage walls. Behind them, Vincent Thorne lay unconscious in a pool of water and broken ambition. 6 months later, the diner was exactly as Elena remembered it. Small, tucked away in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana, the kind of place where the coffee was strong, the pie was homemade, and nobody asked questions about where you came from or why you looked like you were running from something. The television mounted in the corner above the counter was playing the national news on mute, but Elena didn't need sound to know what they were saying. The images told the story well enough. Vincent Thorne in an orange jumpsuit, shackled, being led into a federal courthouse. The chyron read, "Landmark verdict, Aegis CEO sentenced to life without parole." The waitress, a woman named Patty who'd worked there for 30 years and had seen every kind of person the mountains could produce, refilled their coffee mugs. "You folks need anything else?" she asked kindly. The man looked up. His beard was trimmed now, neat and professional, though he still favored his right leg when he walked. The darkness that had once clouded his eyes was gone. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, a woman who was currently sketching the mountain range on a napkin with the focused intensity of an artist. "No thank you, Patty," Sullivan said. "We're good." Elena looked up from her drawing as the news anchor continued detailing the dismantling of Thorne's empire. She smiled, a genuine soft expression that reached her eyes for the first time in 3 years. "You think they're still looking for us?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the screen where a blurred photo of Sullivan's old military ID was being shown under the headline, "The Ghost of Ramadi, Confirmed Deceased." Sullivan took a sip of his coffee, looking out the window at the vast, endless pine forests. "Let them look," he said. "The world thinks Master Chief Garrett Sullivan died in that hospital. And in a way he did. That version of me, the one they broke, the one who was drowning in rage and survivor's guilt, he's gone." Elena reached across the table and took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they'd survived together. The war, the betrayal, the hunt, the choice to build instead of destroy. "We're free," she said softly. "Yeah," Sullivan agreed. "We are." But freedom had come with conditions. The FBI had been very clear about that. 3 days after the arrest, 2 agents had tracked them to a motel in West Virginia. Not to arrest them, to negotiate. The lead agent, a woman named Sarah Vance, had laid it out plainly. "You have 2 choices. Face federal charges for kidnapping, assault, breaking, and entering, and theft of government property. Or you cooperate fully with our investigation, testify against Thorne and his network, and accept new identities under witness protection." Elena had looked at Sullivan. Sullivan had looked at Elena. "What about the charges?" Sullivan had asked. "Immunity," Vance said. "Complete. In exchange for your testimony, Thorne's confession in that loading bay was recorded on hospital security cameras. Your escape, your infiltration, everything you did. We can make it disappear, or we can prosecute. Your choice." It hadn't really been a choice. For 3 months, they'd lived in a safe house outside Richmond. Depositions, interviews, testimony preparation. The FBI had been building the largest defense contractor corruption case in U.S. history, and Elena and Sullivan were the star witnesses. 43 arrests followed. Senior Aegis executives, Pentagon procurement officers, 3 members of Congress who'd taken Thorne's money, Taliban liaisons who'd facilitated the heroin trade. The whole network unraveled like a pulled thread. And then when it was done, when Thorne had been sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, the FBI had delivered on their promise. New identities, scrubbed backgrounds, clean records. Dr. Elena Morgan, RN, MS, Allen trauma specialist. Garrett Sullivan, tactical medical consultant. Not hiding, just starting over. 2 weeks after the diner, Elena found herself walking among the white headstones of Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, the area reserved for the recent fallen, Afghanistan, Iraq, the forever wars that had consumed a generation. Sullivan walked beside her, his gait steady despite the permanent limp. They were dressed in civilian clothes but carried themselves with a respect that spoke of military service, even without uniforms. They found the marker they were looking for. Petty Officer Second Class, Liam Keller Joker is Navy SEAL, gave his life in service to his nation. Sullivan knelt despite his bad leg. He placed his hand on the white marble warm from the afternoon sun. "Hey, brother," he said quietly. "Sorry it took so long to visit. Been busy, you'd understand." Elena stood back, giving him space. But she could hear every word. "We got him Joker. Thorne. He's in ADX Florence. Supermax. Life sentence. No parole. 43 other people went down with him. The whole network. Aegis is dissolved. Assets seized. The blood money stopped flowing." His voice cracked slightly. "I wanted you to know. Your death mattered. All of you. It meant something. The files went public. Changed policy. Oversight committees. New regulations. No more contractors paying protection money to the enemy. Because of what you saw. Because of what we exposed." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. Sorry I made it and you didn't. But I'm trying to live right. For both of us. For all of us." He stood, bones creaking, and rendered a perfect military salute. "Fair winds and following seas, Joker." Elena stepped forward then. She knelt and placed her hand next to where Sullivan's had been. "Petty Officer Keller," she said softly. "I'm Elena. I was Overwatch, the voice on the radio, the one who gave the intel that led you into that ambush." Tears tracked down her face. "I'm so sorry. I failed you. Failed all of you. But I won't fail anyone else. I promise. Your legacy will save lives. Every medic I train, every protocol I improve, every life they save. That's you. That's all of you. Living on through the people we teach." She stood, wiping her eyes. Sullivan took her hand and they walked together back toward the parking lot. Behind them, 5 white headstones stood in a row. 5 Navy SEALs who died on a ridge in Afghanistan because they'd witnessed corruption that reached to the highest levels. But their deaths had torn down an empire, and that Elena thought was a legacy worth the cost. Walter Reed National Military Medical Center looked different in the daylight, less threatening, more hopeful. Elena walked through the main entrance wearing legitimate credentials. Dr. Elena Morgan, RN, MSc, and trauma specialist. The identity was real now, created through the FBI's Witness Protection Program. Not hiding, just starting over. She made her way to room 402. Different patient now, a young Marine corporal named Travis Whitfield. Traumatic brain injury from an IED in Syria. His family sat in the waiting room exhausted and scared. The Marine was agitated, confused, lashing out at the staff. Elena had seen this before. She entered the room alone. The Marine's eyes tracked her with suspicion and fear. He was restrained, just like Sullivan had been, fighting demons only he could see. "Corporal Whitfield," Elena said, her voice calm and professional. "I'm Dr. Morgan. I'm here to help." She sat down next to his bed, didn't crowd him, didn't make sudden movements, just sat with the patient, present and calm. "You're safe," she said. "You're home. The war is over." It took 20 minutes, but slowly the Marine's breathing evened out. The panic in his eyes receded. He looked at her and really saw her. "You understand," he whispered. "I do," Elena said. "And I'm going to make sure you get the care you need. The right care. Not just medications and restraints. Real help." In the hallway outside, Dr. Harrison Blake walked past and did a double take. "Nurse Ashford," Elena turned. "I'm Dr. Morgan. I think you have me confused with someone else." Blake stared. "You look exactly like... But the woman I'm thinking of is wanted by the FBI. Kidnapping charges. Assault on a federal contractor." Elena smiled politely. "I get that a lot. Common face." She walked away, leaving Blake shaking his head in confusion. The resemblance was uncanny, but it couldn't be. This woman had credentials, background checks, references. Still, he'd mention it to someone, eventually. 3 days later, Walter Reed announced a new program, the Combat Trauma Integration Initiative, teaching civilian medical staff tactical crisis medicine protocols developed by veterans. Director Dr. Elena Morgan, guest consultant anonymous former JSOC medical specialist. The first class filled within hours. 30 young nurses and doctors, all eager to learn, all hungry for knowledge that would help them save lives when everything went wrong. Elena stood at the front of the classroom, in the back row wearing a beard and civilian clothes and reading glasses that made him look more like a professor than a SEAL set Sullivan. Anonymous, unrecognized, just another consultant. "Crisis management under fire isn't about following protocol," Elena said, her voice carrying authority. "It's about maintaining composure when everything inside you is screaming to panic. It's about trusting your training when instinct says run. It's about never abandoning your post when everyone else has disconnected. A young nurse raised her hand. Madison, fresh out of school, earnest and scared. Dr. Morgan, how do you stay calm when a patient is dying right in front of you? Elena paused, thought of Sullivan in that hospital bed, of Joker bleeding out over the radio, of 5 voices going silent in the Hindu Kush. You don't stay calm, she said honestly. You channel the fear into focus. Fear means you care. It means you're human. The trick is making the fear work for you instead of against you. Another student, Derek, mid-20s, prior military. What if you make the wrong call? What if your intel is bad and people die because of it? The question hit Elena like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. You will make wrong calls, she said quietly. It's inevitable in this work. What matters is what you do after. Do you learn? Do you carry the responsibility? Do you let it make you better or break you? She met his eyes. I made a call once that got people killed. Good people. The best people I ever knew. And I've spent 3 years making sure that mistake never happens again. Every medic I train, every protocol I improve, every life that gets saved because of what I teach. That's how I carry it. That's how I make it mean something. The classroom was silent. After class, Elena and Sullivan walked down the hospital steps into the evening air. The sun was setting over Washington, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. You're good at this, Sullivan said. Teaching. Someone told me that survivors have stories worth sharing, Elena replied. Might as well make sure those stories save lives. Sullivan was quiet for a moment. I'm going back, he said. Active duty, different unit, different identity. But the SEALs need instructors, people who've been there, who can teach the next generation how to survive what we barely survived. Elena nodded. She'd known this was coming. He was a warrior, always would be. Teaching was her path. Fighting was his. You saved me twice, Sullivan said. Once in Afghanistan, once at Walter Reed. I never thanked you properly. You showed me that vengeance isn't healing, Elena said. You taught me that building something is better than tearing something down. That's a fair trade. They stood at the bottom of the steps. 2 people who'd been through hell together and come out the other side, changed but not broken. Sullivan rendered a salute, military precise. Elena returned it. Then he walked to the waiting car and drove away. Not out of her life, just on to the next mission. Elena watched him go, then turned back to the hospital. She had another class tomorrow, 50 students this time. Word was spreading, the program was growing. She climbed the steps and went inside. 1 week later, Elena stood in front of her largest class yet. 70 students, a mix of young nurses, veteran medics, civilian doctors, and even a few military physicians interested in improving their trauma protocols. The whiteboard behind her read, Protocol versus Instinct when rules fail. Before we begin, Elena said, I want to make something clear. Everything I'm going to teach you comes from real experience, from mistakes made and lessons learned. Some of those lessons cost lives. I carry those lives with me every day. And by the time you leave this program, you'll carry them too. That's the price of this knowledge, she paused. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is being unprepared when someone's life is in your hands. The alternative is watching someone die because you didn't know what to do. So we're going to learn, we're going to practice, and we're going to make sure that when your moment comes, when everything goes wrong and there's nobody else to help, you know exactly what to do. A hand raised. Female student, mid-30s, former Army medic. Dr. Morgan, what's the most important lesson you can teach us? Elena looked at her, at all of them. These young faces that would be out there soon in emergency rooms and combat zones and disaster areas, facing the worst moments of other people's lives. Never abandon your post, she said simply. The students looked confused. When protocol says move on to the next patient, you hold your position. When everyone else has given up, you remain. When there's no hope left and every rational part of your brain says it's over, you refuse to disconnect. Her voice grew quieter, but more intense. Because sometimes the only thing keeping someone alive is a voice in the darkness. A presence that says, I'm here. I won't leave. Keep breathing. Keep fighting. Sometimes that presence is all they have. She thought of Sullivan on that ridge, of her own voice keeping him tethered to life for 4 hours while he bled. You might be that voice for someone someday, Elena said. So you learn everything you can. You train until it's muscle memory. You prepare for the moment when you're the only thing standing between someone and death. And when that moment comes, you refuse to abandon your post. The classroom was absolutely silent. That's not just medical advice, Elena continued. That's a philosophy. It's how you build a legacy, not through one dramatic save, not through one heroic moment, but through showing up, through remaining when others leave, through being the voice in the darkness that refuses to go silent. On her desk sat two photographs. One showed a SEAL team, 6 men in desert camouflage. 5 of them were dead now, but they were smiling in the photo, young, invincible, brothers. The other photo was newer, a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Aegis Global Corruption Scandal, 43 sentenced." "I failed 5 men once," Elena said. "My intel got them killed. That's a fact I live with every single day. But what I do with that fact, how I let it shape me, that's my choice. I chose to make sure their deaths mattered. I chose to build something from that failure. I chose to never abandon my post." She looked at each student. "So when you make a mistake, and you will, the question isn't whether you failed. It's what you build from that failure. Do you let it destroy you? Or do you let it teach you? Do you run from it? Or do you carry it forward and make it mean something?" The class ended 2 hours later. Students filed out quietly, thoughtfully. Several stayed behind to ask questions, to share their own stories of failure and redemption. Elena answered every question, listened to every story, because that's what refusing to abandon your post meant. As the last student left, Elena sat alone in the classroom. The sun was setting again. Golden light streamed through the windows. Her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Training class of 40 starts next week. They need someone who's been there, someone who refused to disconnect. You interested? S. Sullivan." Offering her a position teaching at the Naval Special Warfare Center. The SEALs wanted her expertise, her experience, her voice. Elena looked at the photos on her desk, at the 5 men who died because of her mistake, at the newspaper clipping showing justice finally served. She typed back a single word: yes, because the work wasn't done, would never be done. There would always be another student to teach, another life to save, another person who needed someone to refuse to abandon their post. She gathered her materials and walked out of Walter Reed for the last time as Dr. Elena Morgan's staff instructor. Next week, she'd be Dr. Elena Morgan's Senior Tactical Medical Advisor to Naval Special Warfare Command. The title had changed. The mission hadn't. Never abandon your post, keep teaching, build something that lasts. As she drove away from Washington, D.C., heading west toward Virginia Beach and the SEAL training compound, Elena thought about legacy. Real legacy. Not the kind that came from revenge or retribution. The kind that came from teaching, from passing knowledge forward, from making sure the next generation was better prepared than the last. Somewhere in that compound, Sullivan was preparing his own class, teaching young SEALs how to survive, how to fight, how to make it home. And somewhere in a federal supermax prison in Colorado, Vincent Thorne was staring at concrete walls, 40 years stretching ahead of him. Every day a reminder that 2 people he'd underestimated had destroyed everything he'd built. Not with violence, with truth. Not with revenge, with justice. Not with killing, with legacy. Elena smiled as she drove the sunset painting the highway gold. The ghost of Ramadi was gone. Garrett Sullivan was teaching the next generation. Elena Ashford had become Elena Morgan, and 5 Navy SEALs who died on a ridge in Afghanistan were saving lives through the people who carried their story forward. That was redemption. That was victory. That was refusing to abandon your post. And it was just the beginning.